Every vaccine you have ever received traces back, through a long chain of discovery, to a single idea, that you can teach the body to defeat a disease by giving it a small, controlled taste of that disease before it can kill you. It is one of the most important ideas in the history of human survival. It has saved more lives than almost any concept ever conceived. It is the reason smallpox, a disease that killed hundreds of millions of people across human history, no longer exists anywhere on Earth outside a laboratory freezer. That idea arrived in America in the year 1721. And it did not arrive in the mind of a doctor or a scientist or a founding father. It arrived through an enslaved African man who carried it across the ocean in his own memory and who proved it by rolling up his sleeve and showing his enslaver the scar on his arm. His enslaver got the credit. The doctor who applied it got the credit. The city that was saved by it built its medical reputation partly on it. And the man who actually brought the knowledge to America, the man without whom none of it happens, was left with almost nothing. We do not have his portrait. We are not certain of his birth or his death. We know him mostly through the diary of the man who owned him, who gave him the name we call him by. His name was Onesimus. This is his story, and it is the story of how America learned to survive its deadliest disease from a man it refused to see as a person. Start with the disease because you cannot understand what Onesimus gave the world without understanding the terror he ended. Smallpox was, for most of human history, one of the most feared things on the planet. It killed roughly a third of the people who caught it, and it killed them horribly, with fever, then a rash that turned into pustules covering the entire body, inside and out, in the mouth and the throat and the eyes. Those who survived were often left blind or scarred for life, their faces permanently pitted. It swept through cities in waves, and when it came, people who could afford to fled and people who could not died. In the Americas, smallpox brought by Europeans had already annihilated native populations, killing them by the millions, wiping out entire nations. It was not a disease people managed. It was a disease people prayed about and buried their children over and waited to end. Boston in the early 1700s was a city that lived in periodic terror of it. Smallpox arrived by ship again and again, and each time it burned through the population, and there was nothing anyone could do. The best medical minds in the British colonies had no defense. When smallpox came, you endured it, and you counted the dead. Into that city, sometime around 1706, came an enslaved man. He was West African. He had been captured in Africa, sold into slavery, shipped across the Atlantic, and purchased or received as a gift. In 1706, the congregation of a prominent Boston minister bought an enslaved African man and presented him to their pastor as a present. The minister was Cotton Mather, a name you may know from a very different context, because Cotton Mather was one of the most influential Puritan figures in New England and had been deeply involved in the Salem witch trials a few years earlier. Mather took the enslaved man, and to land, as enslavers did, he renamed him. He called him Onesimus, after a slave in the Bible. We know almost nothing about the name Onesimus was born with or the life he had before the ship. We know he was married. We know he and his wife had at least one child, a son, who died in 1714. We know these fragments because Cotton Mather wrote them down in his diary, and Mather's diary is very nearly the only place Onesimus exists in the historical record at all. Almost everything we know about one of the most important figures in the history of American medicine comes secondhand, filtered through the writing of the man who owned him. And here is the thing that Mather, to his partial credit, did write down. He talked to Onesimus. Over the years, Mather questioned the enslaved man about his life in Africa, and at some point, the accounts place the key conversation around 1716. Mather asked Onesimus whether he had ever had smallpox. Onesimus gave an answer that Mather found astonishing. He said yes and no, and then he explained what that meant. Back in West Africa, Onesimus told him, there was a practice, a deliberate procedure that people underwent to protect themselves from smallpox. You took a small amount of material from the sore of a person who had a mild case of the disease. You made a cut in the skin of a healthy person, and you put the material into the cut. The healthy person would then get a small, controlled case of smallpox, sick, but usually not deadly sick, and afterward they would be protected. They would never get the full killing form of the disease again. And to prove it, Onesimus showed Mather the scar on his own arm, the mark of the cut from when the procedure had been done to him as a boy in Africa. He carried the evidence on his own body. He had been protected this way his whole life. It was why he could say yes and no. He had had smallpox. in the controlled, deliberate form, and so he would never have it in the form that killed. This practice has a name. It is called variolation or inoculation, and it is the direct ancestor of vaccination, the concept from which every modern vaccine descends, and it did not come from Europe. Onesimus was describing a sophisticated medical technology, a genuine piece of preventive medicine that was being practiced in West Africa and, as Mather would later learn, in China and Turkey and other parts of the world, long before European medicine had any answer to smallpox at all. It was African knowledge. It was knowledge Onesimus carried in his memory and his body across the Middle Passage into the household of a man who owned him, in a city that was about to desperately need it. Mather was fascinated. He was, for all his flaws, an intellectually curious man, a member of the Royal Society, and he did what a curious man does. He investigated. He asked other enslaved Africans in Boston, and he found the same thing. The practice was known among them. They described it consistently. Some of them carried the same scar. He cross-checked it against reports he had read of similar practices in Turkey, and he became convinced that this was real, that here was a genuine defense against the disease that periodically emptied his city of the living. But knowing a thing and getting a city to accept it are two different things, and this is where the story turns dark in a way that is almost too on the nose. Because when the epidemic came and Cotton Mather tried to give Boston the very thing that could save it, Boston refused, and a large part of the reason it refused was that the knowledge had come from a black man. In 1721, smallpox arrived in Boston again, carried in on a ship, and it spread like fire. Before it was over, roughly half the population of the city, around 11,000 people, would be infected. Boston was facing one of the worst epidemics in its history, and Cotton Mather was standing there holding the one thing that could reduce the dying, the knowledge Onesimus had given him years before. Mather campaigned for it. He wrote to the physicians of Boston, urging them to try inoculation, and the response was fury. The medical establishment of the city rejected it almost unanimously. The other ministers attacked it as an affront to God, an interference with divine providence, the argument being that if God sent smallpox, it was not for men to prevent it. But underneath the theological objections ran something uglier and more honest, and the historians who study this do not hide it. A great deal of the resistance was flat racism. The idea had come from Africans. Boston's white population distrusted African medicine on its face, could not accept that valuable, sophisticated scientific knowledge could come from the people they enslaved, and rejected it substantially because of where it came from and who had carried it. Think about the exact shape of that. A deadly epidemic is killing the city. A defense exists, and the city refuses the defense in significant part because it cannot bear to accept that the defense came from a black man. People chose the risk of death over the humiliation of being saved by African knowledge. That is not an exaggeration of the record. That is what the record says. The hostility got violent. Mather was vilified, and at one point someone threw an explosive device, a firebomb essentially, through the window of his house. It was attached to a note. The note, by the accounts that survive, said something to the effect of, "Cotton Mather, I will inoculate you with this." The man who was trying to save Boston from a plague had a bomb thrown into his home for it. Only one physician in the entire city was willing to try it. His name was Zabdiel Boylston, and Boylston decided to test it in the most serious way a person can test a medical procedure, on the people he could not say no. In June of 1721, Boylston performed the first inoculations in America. He inoculated his own 6-year-old son, and he inoculated 2 enslaved people in his household. He took the material from a smallpox sore, cut their skin, and introduced it exactly as Onesimus had described the procedure years before. Then he waited to see if they would live. They lived. They got the mild, controlled illness, and they recovered, and they were protected. And so Boylston kept going, inoculating more and more Bostonians as the epidemic raged, eventually treating around 240 people. And then came the numbers that ended the argument, because the numbers were overwhelming. Among the roughly 240 people Boylston inoculated, about 6 died, a death rate of 1 in 40. Among the Bostonians who caught smallpox the natural way, the death rate was 1 in 7. People who got the disease naturally were nearly 6 times more likely to die than people who had been inoculated with Onesimus's method. The epidemic killed around 844 people in Boston, more than 14% of the entire city, and every one of the inoculated who survived was living proof that the African practice worked. The data was undeniable, and it changed everything. Inoculation, so violently rejected at the start of the epidemic, began to be accepted. The practice spread through the colonies, and its consequences reached further than anyone in 1721 could have imagined, because half a century later there was a war, and smallpox nearly lost it for the Americans. During the Revolutionary War, smallpox tore through the Continental Army. Soldiers packed into camps were exactly the conditions the disease loved, and it killed and disabled troops faster than the British did. And George Washington, who had survived smallpox himself as a young man and carried the scars, made a decision that many considered reckless. In 1777, he ordered the mandatory inoculation of the Continental Army. Every soldier was inoculated using the method that had come to America through Onesimus. It was an enormous gamble, and it worked. Historians have argued that Washington's inoculation mandate was one of the most important strategic decisions of the entire war, that without it, the disease might have destroyed the army and the revolution might have failed, and the United States might never have existed. The nation that would spend centuries insisting on the inferiority of Africans may owe its very existence in part to the medical knowledge of an enslaved African man. And then, in 1796, an English physician named Edward Jenner refined the whole thing. He discovered that using cowpox, a milder related virus, was safer than using smallpox itself, and he developed what he called a vaccine, from the Latin word for cow. Vaccination, safer and more effective than variolation, eventually replaced it. Jenner is remembered as the father of vaccination, and his contribution was real. But Jenner's vaccine was a refinement of the concept of inoculation, the concept of deliberately exposing the body to a controlled form of a disease to build immunity, and that concept had been carried into the Western world's most consequential test through the knowledge of Onesimus and the West African practice he described. Every vaccine that followed, down to the ones developed in the 21st century for a global pandemic, sits on top of that foundational idea. In 1980, the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated, wiped from the face of the earth, the only human disease ever completely destroyed by medicine. The line from that victory runs back, unbroken, through Jenner, through Boylston, through the Boston epidemic of 1721, to a West African man showing a scar on his arm to the person who owned him. So what happened to Onesimus? This is where the record, thin the whole way through, nearly goes dark. We know that at some point Onesimus purchased a kind of partial freedom from Cotton Mather. He paid money toward buying himself, and negotiated an arrangement where he gained some measure of liberty while still being obligated to Mather in certain ways. It was the same thing so many enslaved people did with whatever leverage they could find. He bought back a piece of his own life, and after that, he essentially vanishes from history. We do not know for certain when or where he died. We do not know where he is buried. There is no monument at his grave because no one knows where his grave is, and there is no portrait of him. None. No one who had the power to make an image of Onesimus thought he was worth preserving that way. When you see his name today, it is almost always attached to a picture of someone else, of Cotton Mather or of Edward Jenner or of a generic scene of vaccination, because there is simply no image of the man himself. He gave America one of the most important medical gifts in its history and left almost no trace, because the people around him did not consider the trace worth keeping. The credit went where credit always went. For most of the last 3 centuries, the story of smallpox inoculation in America was told as the story of Cotton Mather and Zabdiel Boylston, the brave minister and the courageous doctor who fought Boston's ignorance to bring inoculation to the colonies. And they were brave. That part is true. Mather did champion it against fierce resistance. Boylston did risk everything to test it, but the knowledge was not theirs. They were the transmitters. The source, the person who actually knew how to stop the disease, who carried the technique across an ocean in his own memory, was the enslaved man whose name appears, when it appears at all, as a footnote in his enslaver's diary. It has only been in recent years that the story has started to correct itself. Onesimus's name has begun to surface in medical journals and histories, in the occasional article marking Black History Month. In 2016, a Boston magazine named him one of the most influential Bostonians of all time. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when the entire world was suddenly desperately focused on vaccines and how they work and where the idea came from, A number of writers went back and told his story again, because it had become newly, painfully relevant. The concept underneath the vaccine everyone was waiting for had come, 300 years earlier, from an enslaved African man that history had nearly erased. But the correction is late, and it is partial, and it runs into the same wall every one of these stories runs into. Because Onesimus was not erased by a lack of importance, he was as important as almost anyone in the story of American medicine. He was erased by a lack of standing, by a society that had decided as a matter of law and custom that a black enslaved man could not be a source of knowledge, could not hold a place in the record, could not be a person whose name and face were worth preserving. The erasure was not an accident or an oversight. It was the system working exactly as designed. The same machinery that made it acceptable to own him made it inevitable that his contribution would be credited to the men who owned and used it, and that is the pattern that connects Onesimus to so many others. The enslaved distiller whose knowledge built a whiskey empire under another man's name, the enslaved builders who raised the buildings of American power, the countless people whose skill and knowledge and invention flowed into the country that enslaved them and came out the other side attached to someone else's name, because the law had made it impossible for them to own even the products of their own minds. Onesimus is the purest version of it, because what he gave was so large, not a product, not a building, but a piece of life-saving knowledge that helped end the deadliest disease in human history and may have helped found the country itself. He asked for one thing that we know of, in the end. He bought back a piece of his own freedom with his own money from the man he had handed a gift beyond calculation. That was the exchange. He gave America the knowledge that would help save it from smallpox and help win its independence, and in return he had to purchase, out of his own pocket, a partial release from being owned by the man he gave it to. So here is what to carry out of this. The next time you get a shot, the next time a needle goes into your arm to protect you from a disease, the next time you watch the world race to develop a vaccine against some new threat, you might remember that the whole idea, the foundational concept that the body can be taught to defeat a disease before it strikes, came to America through a man who was owned by another man, that he proved it by showing the scar on his own arm, that the city he tried to save threw a bomb through his enslaver's window rather than accept that he could know something they didn't, that it worked anyway, and saved the city, and maybe the country, and eventually helped wipe smallpox off the earth, and that for 300 years almost nobody knew his name. Onesimus. We do not know the name his mother gave him. We do not have his face. We do not know where he is buried, but every vaccine in the world is, in part, his monument, and it is long past time that the people it protects knew whose knowledge they were protected by. He carried the cure across an ocean in his own body, and showed it to the world on the skin of his own arm. The least the world can do is remember him.